Get ready for a wild ride. First up, we got Ted Bundy. This guy, man, he was the definition of charming on the outside, pure evil on the inside. Like, seriously, he used his good looks, his charisma, to lure his victims into a false sense of security. Bundy, he was like a chameleon, man. He could blend in anywhere, appear completely normal. That's what made him so terrifying. You could be standing next to him in line at the grocery store and never suspect a thing. He was known for his savagery, his depravity. He often revisited his victims, spending hours with their lifeless bodies. Bundy's case, it really shook people up. His case really changed the way law enforcement approached these kinds of investigations. Next up, we got Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee Monster. Born in 1960, Dahmer's life was a series of disturbing events that culminated in one of the most horrifying crime sprees in American history. This guy, man, he was on a whole other level of messed up. His crimes were not just about murder, they were about control, power, and a twisted sense of curiosity. Cannibalism, necrophilia, you name it, Dahmer did it. He confessed to killing 17 young men between 1978 and 1991, each crime more gruesome than the last. He would lure young men back to his apartment, drug them, and then, well, it's some of the most gruesome stuff you've ever heard. His apartment was a house of horrors filled with body parts and disturbing photographs. He experimented on his victims while they were still alive, trying to create some kind of zombie sex slave. His methods were as bizarre as they were horrifying. What's really chilling about Dahmer is how normal he seemed on the surface. He blended into society so well that no one suspected the monster lurking within. Neighbors described him as quiet, even polite. He was the kind of guy you'd never expect to be capable of such atrocities. He worked in a chocolate factory, for God's sake. Imagine that, making sweets by day and committing unspeakable acts by night. It just goes to show you, you never really know what's going on behind closed doors. The facade of normalcy can hide the darkest of secrets. The impact of Dahmer's crimes on Milwaukee was huge, man. The community was left in shock and disbelief, struggling to come to terms with the horror that had unfolded in their midst. People were terrified, and rightfully so. The fear that someone so seemingly ordinary could be so monstrous was a chilling realization. Dahmer's case is a reminder that the darkest impulses of humanity can lurk beneath the most ordinary of exteriors. It's a sobering thought, but one that we must keep in mind. John Wayne Gacy, man, talk about a nightmare dressed up as a clown. This guy was the stuff of real-life horror stories. This dude was literally a clown at children's parties, can you believe that? He'd show up with his painted face and big shoes, making kids laugh, all while hiding a monstrous secret. He'd dress up as Pogo the Clown and entertain kids, all while hiding this horrific secret. Behind that painted smile was a man capable of unimaginable evil. Gacy would lure young boys and men to his house, torture them, and then kill them. He preyed on the vulnerable, those who trusted him. He buried most of his victims in a crawl space under his house. Imagine the horror of living above such a gruesome graveyard. Can you imagine the stench? The horror of finding all those bodies? It was a nightmare for the investigators and the community. What's really messed up is that Gacy seemed like a regular guy, a pillar of the community even. He was the last person anyone would suspect. He was active in local politics, volunteered for charities, he even posed for photos with prominent figures. It just goes to show you, you never really know who your neighbors are. The person next door could be hiding dark secrets. Psychologically, Gacy was a ticking time bomb. His mind was a labyrinth of twisted thoughts and desires. He had a history of abuse, repressed homosexuality, and this warped sense of power and control. All these factors combined to create a monster. He got off on the suffering of his victims, man. It was like he thrived on their pain and fear. The Gacy case, it really messed people up. It shattered the illusion of safety in their own neighborhoods. Jack the Ripper, man. This one's a classic. A name that sends shivers down the spine even today. This is like the OG serial killer story. London, 1888. The city was a bustling metropolis, but it had a dark underbelly. The fog is thick, the streets are dark, and people are disappearing. It was a time of fear and uncertainty. It's the perfect setting for a horror movie, except this was all too real. The terror was palpable, and the fear was genuine. Jack the Ripper targeted women in London's East End, specifically prostitutes. These were some of the most vulnerable members of society. His calling card? Brutal mutilations. The kind of violence that was almost unimaginable. He would disembowel his victims, remove their organs. The brutality was shocking, even to seasoned investigators. It was like something out of a nightmare, the kind of horror that keeps you awake at night. The Ripper's reign of terror sent shockwaves through Victorian England. People were afraid to walk the streets at night. The media went wild. The public was terrified. Newspapers were filled with gruesome details, feeding the frenzy. Everyone was a suspect, from the royal family to local butchers. Paranoia was rampant. The police were completely baffled. Despite their best efforts, they couldn't catch him. What's crazy is that Jack the Ripper was never caught. He eluded capture, becoming a ghost story in his own right. He just vanished back into the fog, leaving behind a legacy of fear and unanswered questions. The mystery remains unsolved to this day. Aileen Wuornos. Now this one's a tragic story, man. Aileen was a prostitute working the highways of Florida. She claimed that she killed 7 men in self-defense, saying they all raped or tried to rape her. Wuornos had a rough life, man. She was abused as a child, ran away from home, and ended up living on the streets. She turned to prostitution to survive, and that's when she met the men she would eventually kill. Her trial was a media circus, man. She was dubbed the Damsel of Death, the first female serial killer. Some people believe her self-defense claims, arguing that she was a product of her environment, a victim of circumstance. Whatever the truth, Aileen Wuornos' story is a tragic one. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. This guy terrorized Los Angeles in the mid-80s. He'd break into people's homes in the dead of night and he didn't discriminate. Men, women, old, young, he didn't care. Ramirez was a Satanist, man. He was into some dark, twisted stuff. He'd leave satanic symbols at his crime scenes and he'd often force his victims to swear allegiance to Satan before he killed them. His crimes were random, unpredictable, and utterly terrifying. People were afraid to sleep in their own homes. Los Angeles was on edge, man. Everyone was a potential victim. Eventually Ramirez was caught thanks to the bravery of some of his intended victims and good old-fashioned police work. Ed Gein, man, this guy, he's the inspiration for some of your favorite horror movie villains. Norman Bates from Psycho, Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Yeah, they were based on Ed Gein. This dude was seriously messed up. He had this obsession with death, with human skin. He would dig up corpses from the local graveyard and make furniture, lampshades, even a mask out of their skin. Gein was a recluse, man. He lived alone in this dilapidated farmhouse in Wisconsin. When the police finally searched his house, they found all sorts of horrors. Body parts, skulls, you name it. What's really disturbing about Gein is that he wasn't some mastermind criminal. H.E.H. Holmes, man. This guy was a straight-up evil genius. He built this hotel in Chicago during the 1893 World's Fair, and it was designed for murder. This hotel, man, it was like something out of a horror movie. It had secret passageways, trapdoors, gas chambers, you name it. Holmes would lure unsuspecting guests into his hotel and then, well, he'd kill them. Holmes was a con man, a swindler, and a cold-blooded killer. He'd take out life insurance policies on his victims, and then collect the money after he killed them. The full extent of Holmes's crimes is still unknown. Holmes's case, it really showed the dark side of the American dream. Well folks, there you have it. A glimpse into the minds and the madness of some of history's most notorious serial killers. It's heavy stuff, man. It makes you question human nature, you know? Thank you for joining us on this harrowing journey. Remember, the real monsters are often hiding in plain sight. Stay vigilant, trust your instincts, and never be afraid to speak up if you see something that seems off. Stay safe, and see you in the next video. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share.